So in the context of global environmental change, behavior spillover is really important. The problem of global environmental change consists in the fact that we need to tackle serious problems, interconnected problems related to climate, related to environmental pollution, and we probably are not going to be able to do it through basically focusing on one or two or three behaviors. We need basically a mass behavior and lifestyle change towards pro-environmental, towards that allows a pro-environmental shift. So that is going to be really an important challenge for all of us. The solutions are not really known yet. Obviously, behavioral science and psychology offers some insights, but possibly we don't know the answer yet. We have enough theory and we know how things work, but we need to see better how the interventions work in behavior change. So the idea of behavior spillover is very helpful and very interesting here. Basically, the background of behavior spillover emphasizes that behaviors are linked together in a complex and dynamic ways. So, there could be possibilities of some behaviors influencing other. For instance, as behavior spillover is defined, observable and causal effect of one behavior of another on another behavior. So basically, it's something that we do observe in especially experimental research, and we know that the causal relationship can be established between different kinds of behavior. For instance, in an easy kind of example, recycling can lead to reuse of items. Yeah, we begin with recycling and then we start to reuse more instead of throwing things away, for example. These behaviors need to be different. Yeah, so it's not different kind of recycling. You can possibly see it within, recycling general waste, and then that can spill over recycling batteries, for example, or vice versa. But generally, this should be distinguishable behaviors. They are sequential, so one follows from the other, and they should be sharing a common motive. In this case, environmental motive is the one that is considered. Behavior spillover theory really offers some important policy avenues, because basically, if it were confirmed, if behavior spillover were confirmed as a phenomenon that actually occurs in particular conditions, then actually our solutions should not be so expensive. Yeah, then we can focus policy solutions. For instance, if we know that goals are important for people, then we should emphasize the goals and build our interventions around, emphasizing the goals, pro-environmental goals. And then from that, basically by encouraging one behavior, we can at the same time get an influence on several other behaviors. So this is why for policy, it's really an exciting perspective. Yet, as you will see today, the evidence is quite mixed, possibly because we haven't analyzed behavior spillover yet sufficiently. It's still a relatively marginal topic. It's quite popular at the moment, but still marginal. So, you can search for insights and try to explain it yourselves as well in your work. That will contribute to this interesting literature. And then research has also mainly focused on positive spillover. So we expect actually what we want. We want that, focusing on one behavior gives us basically an umbrella of various behaviors. And in that way, pro-environmental lifestyles succeeded. But then we also know that there is negative spillover. Some people call it spill under to emphasize the, kind of failure that it brings. So sometimes by encouraging one pro-environmental behavior, we have underperformance in other behaviors. And Of course, as often we have that in psychology, publication bias and just generally probably bias in research interest, we have this kind of problem with less studies focusing on negative spillover. But it's also important to know, yeah, when it occurs. Well, in this kind of, at this time point, I think we already have enough research on both. There is enough to report at least. So we'll look a little bit into it. So this talk today is mainly based on the review that we have done a few years ago for why is climate change. It's on basically climate relevant behaviors. But also in the past, there were a couple of other reviews. They're all, you can refer to the paper and you will also see the reviews quoted. So a couple of other reviews, DEFRA and I think Barnes Truelove review were basically summarizing these points also quite well. So if you're interested in the subject, go and have a look. So let's see a little bit, what positive spillover looks like, substantiated with some evidence as well as negative later. So positive, as we have said already, means an increase in one behavior leads to an increase in another behavior. So we just discussed this regarding our scale that we're developing as a group. We know that environmental behaviors tend to cluster together. Yeah, when we look right now at the big list of behaviors, environmental behaviors that we have, we saw that, they form factors. This can be resource saving, waste management, transportation, etc. So obviously, we know that in any kind of research, we can form clusters usually when the field is relatively heterogeneous. So positive spillover can occur within and sometimes across these clusters. For instance, if we take the cluster of resource saving, that could mean that if we save electricity, we can also start to save gas and water and vice versa. But it can also be sometimes across clusters, which can be a little weird, yeah? Resource saving, so for instance, energy saving could also transfer into better waste management, recycling, for example, or reuse, or, reducing purchasing and so on. And also it can transfer into behavioral intentions, not only behaviors, and also into policy support, which we kind of categorize here as behavioral spillover, but nevertheless, they refer to slightly different categories within. So it's something that we are ready basically to offer support to or to intend to do, but don't necessarily later on engage in this kind of behaviors. Behavior spillover is found through correlational and mainly longitudinal studies, because if we find as a correlational phenomenon, obviously it's very hard to be sure, yeah, that it's not that one follows from the other. So most of the studies that we look into today, most of the studies that look into behavior spillover are measuring behavior in several time points. Also, it can be measured through self-reports. That's probably the most easy and the most frequent mode, but we also can, measure it through objective measures. Nowadays, there are many, possibilities to do so with all sorts of, meters, collecting receipts. So if we talk about purchasing, it can be loyalty card information and so on. So it's really actually easy to form this kind of research and to do it. It can also occur across settings. So for instance, home to work or work to home. There are studies looking at also home to holiday kind of things and finding interesting, things. It can be triggered by situational cues, such as, availability of equipment, particular points in time. So for instance, if you have recycling bin at home, you can also, start organizing, and we see that, at least in the university context, we see quite a lot of this kind of behaviors. Yeah, people who do have the habit of recycling at home, they also do recycle at the university usually. And the availability of the equipment is really important, because if the recycling bin is there, it's much easier for you to think and actually to organize that kind of, to enact this kind of practice. And in that sense, it's also similar to habits. So habits are easily transferred also in the same way, can be transferred across contexts if they are triggered, linked to the same cues. But also behavior spillover can obey to values and identity. And that's probably not least important in our context. When we look into mechanisms, we will see how this works. Here are a few examples of behavior spillover research. So this was one of the pioneering studies by John Torgerson and his colleague Olander. They measured 3 time points in behavior and found that high levels of recycling led to high levels of organic purchasing. So as you can see here, it's across domains: recycling, which is waste management, into another domain of pro-environmental consumption. In another study, basically Torgerson is the pioneer in environmental psychology of behavior spillover research, and he's also one of the main probably proponents of the fact that behavior spillover does exist. But as academics, we should also be quite careful when we ask this kind of question. So it's better to say that evidence is still mixed, but it's not mixed in the sense that, sometimes we observe behavior spillover and sometimes we don't. Basically, that means that we probably are still not searching where we should, actually where we can find it. So it's really important to ask the correct questions, and probably we just don't know how to form the research questions well enough to observe it. Because if it weren't existent, we wouldn't be finding sometimes, behavior spillover. And obviously this study is also controlled for many variables. So the effects that they observe, well, they can be due to other variables, no doubt, as, anything in our reality is, but somehow there is also some degree of possibility that this can happen, and you can probably observe it sometimes in yourself. You can observe it in other people that starting to be interested in one pro-environmental behavior, you continue into others, and basically your pro-environmental practice, our pro-environmental practices, they grow in that way, enriching themselves, one by one. So the idea of behavior spillover cannot be totally rejected, but there is still a lot to consider probably. So in another study, there was a positive behavior spillover following a 6-week intervention to promote organic and eco purchasing. Basically organic and eco purchasing items. So that spilled over onto climate relevant actions such as travel, recycling, and energy saving. Again, we see this rare phenomenon of spillover across domains. But in two studies actually, by Porting and colleagues, we found only marginal positive behavior spillover effects of the Wells plastic bag charge. So basically the charge is there to encourage you to develop this habit of plastic bag reuse. And that hasn't spilled over really much onto pro-environmental behaviors. Well, there was an effect, but very weak. Which can be explained by extrinsic motivation of the charge. So the charge had an economic motivation. But we found interesting things with the English plastic bag charge, and we'll have a look into that in a minute. And we'll also try and explain it why we found something in that domain. So negative spillover is when an increase in one behavior leads to a decrease in another. Again, in the same study, Torgerson and Olander found that organic purchasing predicted lower use of public transport. Negative spillover can occur when one behavior is basically perceived to compensate for another. So in another study, people generated more paper waste when they were giving recycling bin versus general waste bin. So basically being provided with opportunities to recycle, people started to be more wasteful of paper in general. So obviously when we find this kind of Evidence, this is quite alarming, especially this is alarming from the point of impact on the environment, and for policymakers, this could be really worrying. Yeah, we start to do something beneficial and we end up with a bigger problem. So what's in it for us? And how can it be explained? So first of all, there is the explanation of moral licensing. So it's moral entitlement to subsequent self-indulgent or morally questionable behavior. For instance, taking one's bag to supermarkets and purchasing organic food led to purchasing unhealthy snacks. So basically you do something good for the environment and at the same time to basically indulge, you've done something nice, yes, so now you can be doing something less nice and you do something actually not so good for your health at the same time. Or donating to charity that predicted lower climate-related intentions. Yeah, it's again different, completely different domains actually. Health and environment, and here it's social and environmental, and yet they can generate this kind of effects through this moral licensing mechanism. Sagdeva explains this from the point of view of the fact that people differ in levels of connectedness to an issue. So in this case, to an environmental issue, and those who have this, who are less connected, who have lower levels of connectedness, they can underperform. And if we focus on one's values, environmental values in this case, that can actually reverse these effects and change the situation of moral licensing into a more positive one. We also have another explanation of negative spillover, which is contributionetic and single action bias. So contribution ethic basically means a feeling, a satisfaction with something that you have already done that has contributed to a moral, resolvement of a moral issue, and the person feels that they have done their bit and they're not ready to commit into something else. So, for instance, consumers were less likely to reduce packaging if they already recycled. Yeah, and you can often find this. Yeah, I'm sure that you can observe this in people's behavior that they are not really trying to reduce, buying packages, thinking that all of it is going to be recycled anyway. So there could be an impact of a lack of knowledge of, basically our situation with recycling is far from being resolved globally. We don't really, there are basically big amounts of waste accumulated in different parts of the world, and recycling is more of a problem still than what we think. So we shouldn't be thinking that by recycling we completely resolve the problem of waste. Unfortunately not. What we need to do is to reduce the use of packaging, definitely. And single action bias consists in the fact that when two behaviors lead to the same aim, the person can perceive that actually only one of these behaviors will be enough. Yeah. So that leads to underperformance on the second behavior. In a study of Weber, so farmers who engaged in one sustainability practice, they stored grains, kind of climate resilient grains in a particular way, and they were subsequently less likely to engage in other climate relevant practices. So we can observe this kind of things sometimes as a negative spillover. And then we find the rebound effects. Basically, this is a behavioral economics thing. So consumption of an energy service, for instance, can increase due to when we install, energy efficiency improvements, yeah, at home. So this can be something that basically helps us to save energy or to save fuel in our car. And as the result of this, we have the feeling that, you know, this solves the problem and we start to consume more. Yeah. So basically that was also observed a lot in health behaviors when, some of the products can advertise as having very little sugar, and then people start to eat them more. Yeah. We know this kind of um, examples. So the same goes for the environmental, basically, domain. So this can be explained by extrinsic economic motivation rather than understanding of the issue. So usually it's people with lower resources and also people with strong hedonistic value that are the most affected by this kind of problems. With cars, it can also, car efficiency can also be, translated into higher mileages and also buying, less kind of cars that consume a lot of basically fuel, that act on the image of the person. So some of these cars actually do produce a lot of CO2 emissions by the mechanism of how they basically move, how people drive them. Yeah, it's the sport cars probably and so on. So very big cars. So people, by knowing that the car is already fuel efficiency, you can basically, if you can afford it, buy a really big one. Yeah, and then basically your CO2 emissions are higher than in a smaller car. So that can be observed pretty often. And then we have the mechanisms. So the mechanisms of spillover, they go around environmental identity mainly. So from the two behaviors can be connected through the fact that the person identifies themselves strongly as pro-environmental. So combined with knowledge, with skills, that can lead to an enhancement in pro-environmental behaviors generally, and that spills onto different other domains. Goals and values are extremely important, as well as norms. Norms are not normally included in this model. It's the model by Torgerson as well, but originally norms are not included. We now discuss norms as a very strong cluster, so something that can also be encouraged. But we know that we can, act on goals and values, use the goals and values of the person, and that can explain, if I want my behavior to be, if I want my lifestyles to change and to become more pro-environmental, then I'm more likely to, if pro-environmental values are really important to me, biospheric values, I'm more likely to also look for information and be more attentive to information in terms of, links between behaviors. So know that this one also is a pro-environmental, and subsequently I will be also curious to integrate it in my practices, basically. Yeah. Self-efficacy is another one. Basically having resources, having the possibility to act in pro-environmental way is very important. Otherwise the pathways, they are, quite intuitive here. And at the moment, it seems to be, this seems to be the most frequent pathways to be discussed of how behavior spillover occurs. There is another way to think behavior spillover. It comes from social practices. So social practice theory basically comes from sociology. Shove is the main reference to look into it. And well, in psychology, we talk about behavior as kind of an entity, basically. And, some authors emphasize that it has methodological individualism, basically. So we focus on the individual and their behavior, and we don't really think about the wider society. in terms of, how individual behavior is integrated in the wider society. And sociology is different from that point of view. What is important is are the institutions, the society itself, the different organizations. So for sociology, the focus is elsewhere, is on the social side. And that's why it also comes to, look into the same questions from an additional, I would say, perspective that can be really exciting and important. Right now, it hasn't been, still, there have been some discussions on this since about, well, the time runs quickly, but it's already over 10 years. But nevertheless, this is not such a popular topic and still underexplored. But nevertheless, we try to look in different ways how to use this theory. Why it's nice? Because it decomposes behavior into three components. Competences, so these are the know-how, basically the skills, into materials. Materials mean, and probably we should start by materials. So materials is everything that supports the practice. So if we talk about recycling, this will be, and the materials will include all the infrastructure, for that. Both outside of home and inside of home or building, one's office, so on and so forth. Competences are the users of these materials, and meanings, that's where, most of sociology probably comes in. Meanings means basically the socially shared value and the knowledge about this kind of practices and about competences and materials. So it's what gives, basically psychology mainly emphasizes social psychology meanings right now. When we talk about identity, goals, values, that is all in the cluster of meanings, and we overemphasize this. Whereas social practice theory in sociology, actually, for them, none of the three units is most important. They are interconnected, and that's where social practices, that's how they are seen. So basically, by social, we can here, use the word social practice as something that substitutes behavior in this context. So imagine if we talked in psychology about behavior in this way, and probably, because this is just one way to imagine how behavior is, from the sociology point of view, competences, meaning, and materials. Whereas we could probably also think of other, other components that could be important. And probably, we don't talk about this kind of ways to regard our behavior in a way that is more subtle than just, talking behavior and without really knowing what behavior is in itself. And probably that's why, our research on pro-environmental behavior is probably not that, doesn't succeed that quickly as we would like to. So here, when we talk about behavior spillover in the context of social practices theory, we talk about spillover across categories and across domains. So because different competences can be shared between domains, materials can be also shared. If we talk about transport behavior, for example, here the material side can be shared. The same goes for pro-environmental consumptions and so on. And it tells us basically that whereas in psychology, when we focus on meanings, interventions cannot succeed because that's not the only side of the behavior. We also need to consider the skills of the person that can, transfer from one practice. So if we manage to change the competences, then we can change the practice in itself. If we change the materials, that new materials do acquire the new meanings, and that's how basically on the other side a new practice is formed or a new behavior is formed. So as you see, this is quite a nice and quite a nuanced approach. But it still needs to be considered in a less, probably in a more empirical way than, it has been so far. So far, it's theoretical considerations. Okay, so just moving towards sort of the last part of the talk, I'll just give a quick example with another research that we have conducted. So in this case, it was an empirical research, just to give an illustration. The study was on the English plastic bag charge. So in England, in the UK, it was the last basically country to have introduced, different places in the UK, different parts, as Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, they're called countries. So the last country in the UK to introduce plastic bag charge to get rid of single-use bags was England, the richest neighbor, and somehow the one that always waits for the others to test the ideas first and then to implement them. They have the luxury. So when this has happened, basically when other places have already introduced them, England was last, and the success was already confirmed from other places. Basically, this has happened in 2015. And our research looked into ways to measure, first of all, how the plastic bag charge was successful or not, and then to look into whether reducing plastic bag use led into behavior spillover, into spilled over other types of behavior. So here we had 3 waves of data collection separated by first 3 months and then by 6 months, roughly. We mainly looked at England, but our control areas were Wales and Scotland. Here are a few examples of behaviors that we have included in the waste reduction sector. Eco purchasing, recycling, transportation, political action, and public action. So these were all included to look into basically to see whether plastic bag use reduction could be transferred onto these kind of behaviors. And we were already making the hypothesis, so we selected those clusters knowing that possibly reduction in plastic bag use could spill onto waste reduction, into recycling, and we were expecting less in the area of transportation and political and public action, for example, and somewhere in the middle probably eco purchasing. So when we looked into behaviors below, we haven't found any onto behaviors. We looked both at the change in own bag use, and we looked into change in single-use plastic bags, and there was no behaviors below whatsoever. So no effects, even not the marginal ones that we have observed, in the previous studies, looking at the plastic bag charge in Wales. So interestingly enough, because we will see that we don't find spillover here in England, where basically, because one of the explanations for the Welsh plastic bag charge was that it has intrinsic character. The problem here is that when plastic bag charge was introduced in England, there was much more environmental awareness by that time. Just as society progresses, obviously there is more attention to environmental issues. There is more advertisement in terms of why we need to get rid of plastic bags, with all kind of images of animals suffering trapped in plastics and so on. So on the one hand, we didn't observe that in this research. And the sample was large enough, so we could have observed it still, but no. But on the other hand, we did find some spillover. So this is a spoiler for later. Yeah, that's evidence from the survey. And this is the evidence from interviews, qualitative interviews that have accompanied the survey. So people said that basically they don't think that there have been any changes in their behaviors. Um, and basically their rationale for, why should plastic bag charge have had an effect on anything. And this is wave 2. So basically that means that we look into November 2015, 1 month after the charge was introduced. Well, we didn't have the possibility to do a third wave of interviews, and we could have observed probably something, maybe not. But in any case, people said that they haven't become eco warriors just because of the plastic bag charge. But what we found is that people said that their support. So we saw that both with the plastic, with the surveys and with the interviews, that plastic bag charge actually led to a higher support in policy for other similar policies yet to reduce plastic waste. And what also people said that the charge has actually made them, quite happy, in the sense that the problem with plastics needed to be dealt with, that there should be some difference to the landfill, and that, people need to talk about these things and do something about it. So people were quite proud that this has happened, and they supported quite strongly the charge. In the survey, we've also asked, and in the interviews, we've asked them about different other possibilities of policies. 5p charge on plastic water bottles, on excessive packaging, and also an increase in fuel duties. So as you see, there are two different categories here. One is within domain, so plastic, and the third one is outside the domain. So here we talk about fuel taxes. And what we see is that support for fuel duties was very low and non-significant, but we do find some nice effects with the support for plastic bottle charge and plastic packaging charge. So people say that as far as packaging goes on, for example, they are really outraged. So when you go to a supermarket, you basically have to buy everything in plastic. I think that's the situation that we also face now in our country, when more and more, products come already packaged. It's quite hard to buy something without packaging. Whereas, this wasn't the case maybe 10 years ago. When this was just starting. So this needs to be addressed, and people are not really happy with such an amount of plastic on the packaging. But when we look into the third question, support for fuel duty increase, we haven't found any effect here. Basically, the percentages also show us the same. There's a slight increase, in everything. So support basically increases after the charge is introduced for other policies. That's another interesting thing, that we tend to get more support when the things have already happened. Like last week we saw in Cameron Brick's talk something on support of protests, environmental protests and environmental activism. So we do tend to find this kind of things often. But when we talk about unrelated things such as fuel duties charge, this doesn't really happen. A spillover doesn't happen. So people say that instead of introducing charges on fuels, and yellow vests protests have also showed that people were not ready really to accept this kind of policies. the opinions go into the sense of, having cleaner cars, better energy sources, renewable energy sources, and so on and so forth. So it becomes a different topic for them. It doesn't produce a spillover in terms of policy support. And also maybe that addresses the responsibility of the governments and of, businesses to provide, industries to provide options that are easier for people to use in terms of, when it concerns the use of fuel. So not only we find the lack of spillover here, lack of effect, we find also that people emphasize different goals here, basically. Yeah, and that's, also to go into the same bucket, basically, that businesses, pensioners, and everyone who uses cars are going to be affected. So it's not so easy to introduce this kind of changes. Yeah, whereas for plastic bags, when we look into the plastic bag questions and we see that the charge is working well, we should be also looking for, that makes sense to look into other sources of waste. So to conclude, in order to encourage behavior spillover, we look into, well, first of all, we see that the evidence is mixed, and the pathways are normally confirmed. So motivation, people's pro-environmental motivation, and also consistency. I haven't spoken really about consistency when we were looking into this slide, when we were looking into the mechanisms, but consistency basically is also very important here when we, emphasizing inconsistency to a person is leading to basically trying to be more consistent. So people like to keep aligned their values and their behavior, their goals and their behavior. And when one of the behaviors doesn't fit the structure, when that is emphasized to the person can start to perform better on the behavior that hasn't been yet, included into this area. So yeah, so basically motivation and consistency have been emphasized as the key factors to encourage pro-environmental behavior spillover. Our prior goals and values are also extremely important, and they're actually feasible targets for intervention. So we should look, as well as norms. So norms is another really important avenue because it's a very strong predictor, one of the strongest of environmental behavior. We see it in Russia, especially, in Russia, it's people with strong pro-environmental, especially personal norms we've seen in our research that is going soon to be published also. We find that norms are extremely strong predictor of pro-environmental behavior in the absence of, other possibilities, basically. So to encourage pro-environmental behavior, that's what we should target through interventions. And policy regulation is really important. So we should provide basically policies with this knowledge. So environmental policy, when they possess the knowledge on behavioral change. In Russia, that's probably something that is really in its early stages regarding the environment. We may have seen something similar in, in other domains, in other social interventions, but pro-environmental interventions are pretty inexistent, unfortunately, yet. Hopefully, and they're going to develop. But that's in the West. Also, pro-environmental policy are really, late in terms of how they develop and so on. I guess the crisis that we face nowadays with global environmental change is still not, it's disproportionately bigger than any kind of efforts that we are making as a society. So it's really important that policy takes the lessons of behavioral science and implements them. So if policies also help to encourage behaviors, provide these necessary encouragements through, for example, there can be various ways to encourage in terms of, providing additional benefits to the person who commits a pro-environmental action, emphasizes the examples of positive examples of pro-environmental behavior, educating, of course, in schools and universities, because that's how we bring up a whole generation of people who will understand why this is important and what to do about it. And just basically, as we all should be trying to do when we do environmental research, try and share it with the general public. Definitely the lessons, what kind of actions we need to do to preserve the environment. That is really, really important. And the policy here could encourage these kind of actions really, easily. They have particular tools, and these tools can be easily used. Yeah, so this is what I wanted to say today. So yeah, research on behavior spillover, it's still in this kind of, despite, the number of years that, some of it is there for nearly 20 years soon. But still, we probably don't know enough, and we need to research it more and understand it better. And probably to try and integrate it in the policy. So thanks very much for your attention. Here's the link to our environmental psychology group. Feel free to connect. And I'm happy to answer any questions now. Okay, if anyone has questions.
Okay, hello. This is Kingsley.
Hello, Kingsley.
Yeah. So thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I wanted to ask with regards to the behaviors that usually have the most impact in terms of the spillover effect. What behavior would you say would potentially have the most impact in making someone perform other behaviors when they are first introduced? So which ones have the most spillover impact?
Yeah, that's a question that has been looked into, but probably there is not much evidence. What we know that probably the more easy ones they will spill over into more difficult ones later. So it's a kind of a gradual process in terms of difficulty of performing it. Yeah, so it's easier to engage one first in an easier behavior, and then later that can spill over onto more difficult action. But somehow there hasn't been the question hasn't been really asked that much from this point of view. Yeah, what is easier to encourage behavior spillover? Probably there was a lot of research into probably what's more available in terms of measuring. So things like eco-purchasing, yeah, maybe energy behaviors, or some particular areas, as we have seen, yeah, with sustainable practices, but not really a conclusion on the types of behavior that are easier to encourage behavior spillover. It hasn't been considered from this point of view sufficiently yet.
Okay, that makes sense. So with regards to the motivation for environmental behavior, say for example, someone has a frugal motivation to be frugal, and another person has maybe a motivation for like purchasing eco products. So would you say that the categories of environmental behaviors within those categories are more effective in making spillover within their categories? Like in terms of, for example, if I am a frugal person, I may want to save on resources. So does the motivation of being frugal make that the behavior spillover will be within that category of resource saving and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, when I think when we talk about spillover, when we talk about domains, we talk more, kind of separating them into themes. Like I said in the beginning, it's more, one is waste reduction, another one is transportation, a third one would be saving energy. So when we talk about domains, it's more like that. What you're talking about is the difference in motivation. So usually when we talk about spillover, we consider some linkages. Yes, also we said in the beginning there should be linkages for people, and usually this is the environmental background basically that links them. But this environmental background is not known for everyone. So indeed, it can be economic only. And in that case, well, some studies show that actually when we emphasize economic motivation, we can get a spill under actually, so the negative spillover can occur. And, we've seen that with a few examples, and that's emphasized over and over again. So it's something that can actually hamper spillover, and we should then in turn emphasize values, pro-environmental values, to reduce that effect. This is a difficult, it's an interesting question, because on the one hand, I think we need to we need to take on board any kind of motivations right now, because what we need is to solve this situation. That would be best. Because environmental crisis is such that, I think we just don't quite realize it living in cities, especially. We totally disconnected from nature and so on. So we don't really know, but having the news, for instance, just I think yesterday there were news on the Guardian that something like 17.5 tons of plastic waste was washed onto one of the coasts of the US. That just shows the amount of the problem, and it's probably just one case that we see like this. The situation is really important, so we need to kind of solve it from different perspectives, and to use both economic motivation and frugal motivation, whatever, and environmental motivation. In the long run, we know that in pro-environmental motivation based on values, for example, and identity, is much more durable. And it's also something that also, gives us a sense of responsibility, because I think our society globally, if it avoids the fact of responsibility and of, acting on what is really important to us, of the values, and also, things as self-transcendence and so on, which are basically helping every single bit in the society, then we don't really, that's not sustainable development. I would say it's probably something that needs to be written down one day, how this is all linked together. But that looks like, all the research kind of shows that intrinsic motivation is more durable and more helpful. Probably it's something that also needs to be emphasized within the society beyond environmental domains. But when we also discuss things as penalties and any kind of fiscal measures, basically we find the same thing, that fiscal measures with plastic bag charge, probably why it hasn't yet spilled over onto other behaviors, because it's an economic instrument and because it relates to one single action. Luckily enough, in the UK, they have explained that this is the whole problem of environment. There is a lot of information on environment that we don't have here, for instance, in Russia. Only marginal, sort of, how to say, not marginal people, but people who, with the margins of society are interested in environmental information and, educate themselves and talk with each other and so on, go to eco shops and so on and so forth. But the majority is not doing that. So you know it's important to use the measures that we have available, but we should also know that that is not going to solve our problems at the root of our problems. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. And that's why fiscal measures and extrinsic motivations such as financial or maybe some other, hedonic motivations or whatever, yeah, because we do find occasional links between also hedonism or, these kind of things with with environmentalism, but it's not going to help in the long run. What we need to do in the long run is to emphasize the root of the problem, so that we are actually responsible as a society, because there was a lot of purchasing economic gain. This is what got us into trouble with environmental crisis, and that's why we are facing it right now. So instead of thinking how to, basically now we need to think how to resolve this issue. And if we, for instance, yeah, this is a far going question probably. So if we look into renewables nowadays, yeah, we can think that, we should probably look for sources, the metals, yeah, in the ocean, because on Earth there are not many more resources left in terms of to build all the renewable, basically accumulators to store renewable energy and so on. So one of the ideas to go to search them in the ocean and to dig the ocean. Yeah. After that, I don't know where we'll go as a society, but this is not really it's kind of getting deeper into the same problem rather than to try to solve it from the outset. So we constantly thinking of how to grow, how to progress, instead of probably thinking to come back and to look into the root of the things and to see especially the consequences of our actions. So I think here again, frugal and economic motivations are not going to basically, yeah, in the short term also they show to be not so good, but in the long term as a civilization definitely not going to bring much benefit. In the meantime, we can use them if there is nothing available, but I think we should be looking into more solutions that emphasize everyone's responsibility regarding their actions. Yeah. Okay, sorry, that was a long answer.
Yeah, no, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I actually agree with that. That for sustainability, for a sustainable way forward, I think it's going to be much more beneficial to promote self-transcendent values and like inherently intrinsic motivations to be pro-environmental. I definitely agree with that. But of course, due to the imminent threat that we are facing right now, of course, it's going to be, it's not going to hurt to look at different measures as well, different areas um, to make a consolidated effort to bring forth the change that we need. So I agree with you for the sustainability, for sustainable development, and for future, um, for the future, basically moving forward in that domain. I think is going to be much more beneficial to look at self-transcendent values. I agree.
Yeah, now we need to think how to encourage that in the society. That's not an easy job. Hopefully some lessons will be useful, but there is a long way, I think, still, but not impossible.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Kingsley. It's great. Any other questions? Yeah, please feel free to ask. Last call for questions. Otherwise, we can also end here today. Okay. In that case, thanks everyone for coming. So do join our seminars. The next one, I think, is going to be on the 13th of May, Thursday, 13th of May. That's going to be a seminar on spillover as well. from a colleague in the UK, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you and take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.